This turbo's too big. You're never going to get it up. You're never going to run out of turbo. Next thing you know, we went to the 91, then we went to the 94, then we went to the 98, and then we pulled the 98 off, and we're going, you know what, stuff it, let's just put the 110 on it. It's pretty much gone from an 88 to a 110, and you're still looking for more turbo as well.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Con from Croydon Racing Developments, or CRD, in Sydney, Australia. Con is responsible at the moment for tuning and developing, for that matter, JUNII, which is an R32 Nissan Skyline GT-R. The claim to fame here is that at the time of recording, this was is the fastest GT-R in the world, with a 6.37 at 224 mile an hour. Arguably, it is street legal, maybe street legal-ish. I don't know how far you want to go down that particular path, but I'm not here to argue it. Fact is, you can do a 6.3 on the quarter, rock back down the return road, and even drive the car back to the workshop via the McDonald's drive-through if you want. Probably doesn't have air conditioning, might not be the most comfortable ride, and hopefully you don't see any police on the way home, but that's beside the point. That 637 also makes it the fastest outright four-wheel drive drag car in the world. This is no joke. Now, Con goes through his background story of how he got involved in cars, and more specifically, how he learned to tune from the previous owner of CRD. And this is obviously always a difficult industry to break into, so it's interesting to get Con's perspective on how he learned from his mentor and then how he started developing his own skill set before really jumping in the deep end and tuning cars like JUNII. Before we jump into our episode with Con, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialise in teaching people how to tune, how to build engines, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover race car setup, race driver education, fabrication, 3D modelling, and CAD, just to name a few. All of our courses are delivered in high-definition video-based modules that you can take from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This gives you the flexibility to learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. Once you've purchased a course from us, it is yours for life. You can rewatch it as many times as you like, and there is zero risk of purchasing. All of our courses come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money back guarantee. You can find a full list of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses, and as a podcast listener, you can use the coupon code podcast75. That'll get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. And if you like free stuff, have I got a deal for you. HPA is always sponsoring with big names from the industry and giving away products. There is no catch to this, no purchase necessary, and you can find our current giveaway by heading to hpacademy.com/giveaway. We'll chuck links in the show notes to those as well, so it's super easy for you to find. Enough about our introduction, let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Con. Thanks for joining us today. And as usual, let's start by finding out how you got interested in cars and the automotive scene in the first place.
Well, to be honest, actually, I enjoyed cars. I like cars, obviously, back in school, but I never really wanted to be a mechanic, to be honest.
Okay.
As usual, I left things to the last minute and didn't organise my Year 10 work experience. So Theo, who was part owner of Croydon back in the early 2000s, and obviously one of the founders, he was actually a relative of ours. So one thing led to another. I ended up going there to really, start work experience there, just to sort of get me out of school, to be honest.
Okay.
So I started there, and to be honest, I didn't really like the whole import scene. I was more of a V8 guy.
Oh, how times have changed.
Yeah. So it actually changed pretty quickly, to be honest. So I remember there was, back then, I think it was like a VH or a VK Commodore. Went on the dyno and I was all excited. This thing was making a whole heap of noise, and it made about 150 kilowatts.
Sounds about right.
And I was like, yeah, fair enough. That's pretty cool. Then a 200SX went on. It sounded like a vacuum cleaner, and pumped out 250. I'm like, hold on, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, there's a bit of a disconnect there, surely.
Yeah. And then, one thing led to another. Obviously, opened my eyes a bit. You got this little 2-litre pumping out almost double the horsepower that this other thing was, and it's double, half the capacity.
On that note, I mean, we see this in New Zealand. I got involved in the drag industry here in New Zealand, import drag scene, when it was very much V8 biased. And frankly, we'd go to a drag meeting and we weren't really liked. until we started running in the 8s, which sort of, some of them started to take notice. And we sort of see that in Australia, and I think to a degree in the US as well, the sort of like the domestic versus import scene. How hard was it to break down those barriers and sort of get the import scene to expand in Australia?
Well, look, I think the import scene had sort of well and truly kicked off when I came into it. Jim back then was obviously pushing it pretty hard. He started in the early 90s with the Swifts, when it was really just setting off. When I come in, GTRs were big, but it wasn't the be-all and end-all sort of thing back then. And back then we had the whole drag combat things, which obviously pushed the whole scene as well. You had your auto salon, dyno comps, that sort of thing. And it's gone, I guess, just gone from strength to strength. They've really kicked off. And I guess back in the mid-2000s, it hit a bit of a, probably 2005, I reckon, 2012. It hit a bit of a flat spot, I think. Not much really evolved, changed. And then all of a sudden, it's like you just put a rocket up and the thing just took off.
Yeah, sure. And I think there's definitely was a little bit of a struggle here in New Zealand with people accepting them initially. But like you say, I mean, you've got a small capacity 2-litre engine with a turbocharger making sometimes double the power of a conventional V8 of the time. So it's hard to argue with those numbers. But I mean, there's obviously an individual choice as well. Not everyone likes the sound of a 4-cylinder engine, or 6-cylinder as it may be.
Yeah, of course. Look, I think you're always going to have your V8 guys and your import guys, but I don't think really where the cars have gotten these days, I don't think the V8 guys can say too much other than wow, to be honest. Like, they're punching above their weights, what we're doing with the import stuff. So
I mean, when I first started, the old saying was always there's no replacement for displacement, but I think that one hasn't aged that well realistically.
No, because there's turbochargers.
Yeah.
So you can just put a bigger turbocharger on it these days.
Well, coming back to when you sort of snuck in the back door of CRD and started work experience. So up to this point, you said you had a bit of an interest in cars at school, but nothing too serious. Had you built up any mechanical skill set at that point, or were you starting from zero?
Other than playing on my own, XF Falcon back in the day, not really. Hadn't really done anything, to be honest. Playing around with bikes and cars, that's about it. I pretty much went in blind, not knowing what to expect. And yeah, it just sort of kicked off from there. I enjoyed it. And then ended up doing school holidays, weekends, pretty much for the next 2 years. And then as soon as I finished school, I literally finished, I think, my last exam on the Wednesday or Thursday, and then started work on the Monday. So I was pretty keen to sort of get into it.
Okay. So on that basis, did you go down the path of doing your mechanical qualifications or qualification as a mechanic?
Yeah, so I enrolled in TAFE, done my 3 years in TAFE and completed that. And then once I completed that, it was just pretty much everything at work. So there was no real qualifications you can get for the whole performance side. A lot of it is learning in the industry. So
that's what I wanted to dive into there. So it's good that you brought that up. These days I sort of see people who want to go down that path of becoming a mechanic. I mean, sure, obviously the skills, the way the engines work predominantly has always remained the same. But I see a lot less mechanical work being done these days on more modern cars, and a lot of being a mechanic these days seems to be more focused around using scan tools, diagnostic tools to find and fix faults. So is that kind of an accurate representation of what's happening if you go into maybe a dealership as opposed to a performance workshop?
Yeah, pretty much. It's changed a lot. So in the early 2000s and earlier, you really had to use your mechanical knowledge to diagnose a car and go through it. You didn't have the availability of all the scan tools you do today to pretty much point you in the right direction. So it was a lot of fault finding and diagnostic work you had to do. Nowadays, a lot of people just plug in a scanner, and if a scanner's not telling them, they're going to think the car's okay. So unfortunately, it's gotten to that. And you still get your mechanics, obviously, that work at dealerships that have an idea what's going on. But there's also a lot that if it's not written down in front of them, they'll struggle to find it.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of skills that are being lost, and for obvious reasons, the likes of cam belt changes, which are a pretty typical maintenance item on most engines that run a cam belt. But of course, these days, most manufacturers have switched from cam belts to chains, which are almost maintenance free. And a classic example of this I've seen here in New Zealand, and I see reports of it around the world, is the Toyota 86 had a recall at one point on one of the models for valve springs. So it's a pretty major job. The engine had to come out and the valve springs get replaced. And I think one of the dealerships, and I won't name names, one of the dealerships, they had about a 50% failure rate because those engines are reasonably complex to time back up with the dual chains. I mean, it's not rocket science, but I think it just shows the mechanics aren't getting their hands dirty to that level these days like they used to. So again, no disrespect. I mean, obviously they're doing the tasks that they see come in the door. So you were in the fortunate position to be at CRD building up that skill set beyond what you learned in TAFE. So what was your sort of day-to-day back then in terms of working on performance cars?
I guess it's changed over the years. When we first started, you used to have a lot of cars come in for the usual maintenance stuff, like you're saying, cam belt, stuff like that. Then we also, back then, it was in the early stages of engine management, aftermarket engine management systems. So there was a lot of piggyback stuff. So back then we were fitting a lot of uni chips, a lot of fuel cut defenders and all stuff like that, we used to pump out those like clockwork. Pretty much boost controllers, blow-off valves, stuff like that. All that stuff that these days everyone does at home, no one used to touch them before. Everyone used to bring them to the shop to do. And then it's gone from that started dying off, and then it started getting slowly more and more chasing the performance side of things, upgrading turbochargers, intercoolers, all that sort of things, fuel systems. And it's just pretty much spiraled from there. Nowadays, I'm finding that it's not people doing small stuff now. They go from pretty much 0 to 100 very quickly. So that whole middle part of the scene has sort of died off, and all the more serious stuff is kicking off, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. All right, so what we really got you on the podcast to talk about, however, is EFI tuning. And that's a very different skill set to being a mechanic, a performance mechanic. How did you sort of progress from being a mechanic to the tuning side?
Pretty much I spent the first, I'm going to say at least 3 years on the dyno with Jim.
So Jim was one of the founders of CRD?
Yeah, Jim was a founder of Croydon Automotive, and then later on, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, he merged with Racing Emotion, which started Croydon Racing. And then it's obviously, they've taken off from there. But Jim was the main tuner, performance side of things, engine building, that sort of thing. So I pretty much just glued myself to Jim for the first 3 years. Obviously, being new in the whole scene and learning, obviously apprentices spent a lot of time on the dyno, helping out, listening for knock, that sort of stuff, keeping an eye on things. So I pretty much focused a lot of time on just watching what Jim was doing. And I didn't really start getting into the tuning itself until probably 2000. I think the first car I tuned was my own, or one of my mates' cars. And then while I was still working under Jim done most of the tuning. I'd help out with some of the setup stuff and log in and, going over things if the cars are out racing, whatever else. But tuning itself, I didn't really start till probably 2016, 2017 on my own. I always done it with Jim overseeing me sort of thing before that.
Yeah. Okay, so in these days, what sort of ECUs was the mainstream that you're seeing through the door?
We've done a lot with Gold Box MoTeC back in the day. Croydon was one of the first people to sort of be on the MoTeC, I'm going to say bandwagon, but we were using MoTeC predominantly in a lot of the cars, back from the M8s, M4s, and then progressed to the M800s. And we're going from there. So we usually used to only use that on all the higher end stuff, on all the more serious cars. Back then, you obviously had your Haltecs and Microtecs and stuff like that, the old Wolf ECUs as well. EMS, that sort of thing. But nowadays, honestly, we don't really play with any of those. It's mainly Haltec, MoTeC, M-Trons. They're pretty much the main three that we'll use these days.
I think that's probably similar to most performance workshops. They sort of tend to gravitate towards a handful of different ECU brands that kind of fit the requirements and price point of the customer base. Because as you say, sort of MoTeC back in the day of the Gold Box, now it's the M1. But that is obviously a higher priced product compared to the likes of Haltec, for example. So we had a couple, but that we chose just based on what the customer's requirements were. Would you say, though, obviously there's an element of learning the user interface and the software for a particular brand of ECU, but would you say that your skill set, and once you actually know how to tune, it's not too much of a drama to adapt to a new platform?
Yeah, pretty much. Once you obviously understand, your fundamentals with everything, then really just finding where each table is. And every ECU manufacturer uses different terminology for things. So sometimes you jump on a Haltec and you're trying to find something that's labeled as what's in the MoTeC, or vice versa. So sometimes you just sort of adjust. Oh, shit, I'm on a Haltec, not a MoTeC. Okay. So you just got to adjust with that when you're on them, pretty much. That's it.
I think the other element, though, that is important, and I have this question come up quite a bit, what ECU should I run? And this is from a customer's perspective. And my answer there is always the same. Whatever your tuner is going to recommend. And I think there's this sort of belief out there that if I buy the most expensive ECU that's on the market, well, I'm going to get the best job, I'm going to get the best results, and I'm going to make the most power. And the reality is, if you took an M1 ECU, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, but it is a reasonably complex ECU, or let's say Bosch Motorsport, something that is genuinely at the top level. It's very complex, and if you took that to a tuner that had never tuned anything other than a Haltech, A, they're probably going to take a lot longer to tune because they're going to need to learn this new system, but B, for their first job on a new platform, they're probably going to get a subpar result because they don't know all of the nuances of that platform. So what I'm getting at here is, versus a €10,000 Bosch Motorsport ECU or a $2,500 Haltech, you're probably actually going to get a better result with a tuner that knows the Haltech inside and out, and they're going to do it faster. So do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. That's the first thing, because I get asked by a lot of other people from, that don't necessarily have to be at the shop, that, come to your shop, and I just don't speak to your tuner. Whoever's tuning your car, you go with what they want. Forget what I'm telling you, because what works for me might not work for someone else.
I think the other element is people want to not take that advice because they've already got built up in their mind right from the start of a project car build, I want to run this ECU because probably they've seen it out there or in magazines or on the internet, and that's sort of, they're predetermined for that particular platform. But again, the other element with that is I think sometimes there's a belief that you're going to get sort of pigeonholed into a particular ECU from a performance workshop because that shop is going to make more money on the product. And I can't say that that's not the case for some shops, but across the board, I'd say that is very rare. They're going to try and choose the best ECU for your requirements, something that they know they can get the results out of.
Yeah, of course.
All right, so moving back to your experience tuning, what you said you started with your own car with Jim overseeing that. How long did you take before you felt comfortable and proficient with tuning?
Comfortable was, how can I put it? How long did I take? Look, it wasn't really until I took over the business with Omar that I actually had no choice but to feel comfortable.
Jump in the deep end.
Yeah, pretty much everything. A lot of what I've done has been thrown in the deep end, to be honest. From engine building to tuning, it was literally the first serious car I'd done from scratch would have been War GT-R.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that was the first one I'd done from go to woe sort of thing. So it was definitely nerve-wracking, that sort of thing. How can I put it? You know what you're doing, but at the same time, you got to back yourself as well. So it is a bit of a confidence thing as well, to back yourself, to trust your judgment and what you're doing. And with every car, it's always different. You know what I mean? Still today, I can tune a car and go to the track for the first time and I'll be nervous. It's not because I don't feel confident in what I've done. I know I've doubled and tripled and quadruple checked everything, but you still have those nerves until the car does its first lap or first run and you come back and you go, yeah, okay, we're all good, let's go.
Yeah, definitely.
So you just don't know. The dyno's one thing, the track's something else. So, and it's been, I can't say I've had any real big hiccups, so to speak. Definitely been a lot of learning on the way, but nothing too drastic. Do you know what I mean? I
think a lot of people assume that in the process of learning how to tune, you're going to break dozens of engines along the way. What would you say to that?
No, I don't agree with that. I always try err on the side of caution. I try to be conservative. And again, that's one of the reasons I guess I don't do too much e-tuning as well. I like to, how can I put it, feel the car, hear the car. You know when something's not right by hearing it. When you're on a computer screen looking at, a bunch of numbers from the other side of the world, you can't always get that feeling, that sort of thing. So numbers are one thing, but feeling it, hearing it, understanding is another thing as well.
Yeah, I agree. I had some experience doing some remote tuning with a couple of drag cars over in Germany, and it's just the weirdest experience. I was sort of team viewing into the ECU, and you sort of see during a ramp run on the dyno, you'd see the cursor moving through, and it's just the weirdest experience. There's no noise, nothing, and then sort of after the run, a minute later, I'd get sent a dyno plot. It's just odd. It kind of just removes some of the sensors that I think you subtly rely on that might not be that obvious.
Yeah, I agree. I'm big on hearing it and sort of feeling it, being in the car and actually getting the feel of the car. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Coming back to breaking engines to learn, I first of all absolutely agree with you. I don't think that you should be breaking engines. There's elements to this that I want to talk about though, because first of all, if you understand the sort of air-fuel ratios you should be targeting for a given load, let's say boost pressure and fuel, then you should be able to achieve those, and those should be safe. So you shouldn't be melting engine components because you're too lean. The ignition timing is a little bit trickier, but I mean, I'm a big fanatic for using knock control, or generally I'll be using audio knock detection. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And again, if you keep the engine away from detonation, that's really the two biggest killers of the engine. The third one, of course, is exceeding the power handling capabilities of the engine components. And I find that is a little bit of a different situation, because particularly with what you're doing, building and tuning some serious drag cars, and you're trying to beat world records, you're kind of getting into this uncharted territory. And at that point, you can end up exceeding the power handling capability of some of the components. I think that's a little bit different, but damaging an engine because you ran it into detonation or the air-fuel ratio was too lean, those are things that you absolutely should be able to avoid. So, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I look at that as pretty much negligence. Someone that's not really respecting another person's, pride and joy and their own reputation, to be honest. So, some people just want to throw XYZ timing figures in and, run it. And you can literally see, I see some pictures of dyno graphs, and I can literally see that there's an issue with either fuel delivery or the tune side of things, and they'll rev it and the thing will go down to 10 AFRs, and next thing you know, the thing's leaning off to 13. You're like, okay, there's something right there. That's not, if they let that go, that's not going to be right. So I do see that. I do see a lot of people tuning around issues, whereas I don't like tuning around issues. If the car has an issue, whether I'm going to upset someone or not, I'm going to tell them this and this isn't right, because I prefer to cover my own ass and make sure if it's not right on the dyno, it's not going to be right on the road. It's only going to get worse on the road.
I think the thing that's tough sometimes is you've got a car owner there, watching their dyno session, something's not right. Maybe it's not a major, but something's not quite right. And there's sort of that assumed pressure to get the job done so that the customer can drive their car away. But the reality is, if you put a Band-Aid on a problem or ignore a problem, overlook it, your reputation that gets affected at the end of the day, because, let's say it's just poor drivability or something like that. I mean, that customer has then got to live with that. And of course, the tuner's the last person to touch the car. You're a hero when everything goes right, and you go from hero to zero real quick when it's not.
Yeah, that's right.
Just let's come back a little bit to tuning higher powered engines. More to the point, when you're getting started, what would you suggest for people listening who want to learn how to tune would be a good base model to sort of have a play around, something relatively safe that they can learn and develop their skills on without too much risk of damaging it?
Yeah, I think NA stuff will probably be the easiest to start learning on. To be honest, I actually find tuning NA stuff rewarding. I enjoy it, because you're literally trying to find every kilowatt, and you need to start thinking outside the square other than just throwing another couple of pounds of boost in or sort of thing. So I enjoy tuning the NA stuff as well. Every now and then we get a little pulsar come in, or, a 4AGE or something like that, and it's like, okay, let's go. Let's have a bit of fun.
I absolutely agree. It's very, very satisfying, actually, both from an engine building and development side as well as the tuning side. You just got nowhere to hide with a naturally aspirated engine. You don't have that Band-Aid of chucking another couple of pounds of boost at it to get the power numbers. So, and when you get that combination absolutely singing, it is very satisfying.
Yeah, a car might leave you and it makes another 10 kilowatts and the customer's over the moon, and then they'll go drive it and they're like, it's the best thing in the world. Like, it's 10 kilowatts.
All right, so coming back from that, so yeah, I think naturally aspirated definitely is a good place to get started. What would you say though? I mean, again, turbocharged engines being more common these days, and obviously everyone's starting to push the boundaries of power. If someone is build up their own project car and maybe it's a 800 horsepower capable 2JZ or RB26, is that a possible starting point for your first tuning project, or are you just asking for trouble?
It depends on how adventurous this person wants to be, and how conservative they want to be. I think if you start conservative, leave everything on gate pressure, get your fuel mixtures where you want, and just leave some very conservative timing figures in it, then you can start and build on that. And then obviously something from there, you can just slowly creep up on it. Slow and steady wins the race with this stuff. I'm a firm believer of that.
And I think it's important to point out that if it is, for example, that 800 horsepower combo I just dreamt up, chances are that the first pull on the dyno is not going to be 800 horsepower. As you mentioned, you're going to start on wastegate pressure, the lowest pressure that you can achieve with the spring and the wastegate. Let's say that might be 12 psi. Maybe you could even start with a 7 psi spring in the gate to start with, and get a tune dialed in at a much lower power level, maybe 400-500 horsepower, and then just step up very slowly. I think it is possible. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but the element here is that your tuning window to keep the engine safe is obviously going to be a lot narrower on a highly strung turbocharged engine than a low power NA. And the tuning principles remain exactly the same, but of course, when you're just getting started, you're going to be a little bit slower to recognize things and make these changes. And if you're outside that window, it is going to be possible to damage the engine quite quickly. Let's talk a little bit about dynos, and specifically, what dynos have you got at CRD?
We've got two. So we've got a four-wheel drive chassis mainline and hub as well with the mainline.
Okay, so you're in a really good position here to give us a comparison. I mean, the rolling road chassis dyno kind of always was the gold standard in dyno technology. More recently, I think almost everyone around the world that's building serious high-powered cars has sort of moved towards the hub dynos. From your perspective, pros and cons of each?
If you want to tune for horsepower and full throttle stuff, I think the mainline hub dyno is probably the go-to. It's much more, it repeats obviously much better. You don't have the issue of tyres getting hot and obviously soaking the horsepower as well. And it's very controlled. You don't have to worry about trying to steer the thing on the dyno on a high horsepower thing. So, but for me personally, if you want to tune for drivability, even flat shift and stuff like that, I prefer the chassis roller dyno. I don't feel I can get the part throttle tune where I want it on the hub. I'm not happy with how can I put it? Personally, I'm not happy with how it sort of tunes on the hub. You don't have that rolling inertia, whereas on the chassis, I can get it into load sites and places that I can't really get it to on the hub, if you know what I mean. So I'd either do more of my base stuff on the chassis and then move to the hub, or I'd start on the hub and then finish off on the chassis. So depending on the car.
Let's just dive into that a little bit further for those who maybe sort of aren't up to speed. So the problem on the hub dyno is, let's say you're at 3,000 RPM and you're doing some light throttle tuning. So you want to dial in your fuel and ignition sites, basically just barely breathing on the throttle. The problem is, because there's no inertia in the dyno, as you come out of the throttle to get into those lower load sites, the dyno just slows down, so the RPM drops and you can't get to the sites you want to. Whereas the rolling road, on the other hand, a lot more inertia in those big rollers, so it tends to hold the actual road speed, which in turn holds the engine RPM, so you can get down lower. And I reckon this is an area that the majority of tuners don't think about, know about, or just can't be bothered doing. And I base this on the number of cars that I've retuned where that part throttle drivability is just absolutely garbage. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. For me, I don't think you can do part throttle stuff on the hub dyno properly at all. If you do, then the problem is you can't even do it on the road properly.
It's still the same situation where on the road, as you roll out of the throttle, obviously the same deal occurs. The car's going to slow down. The interesting part, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is that on the road you can get into areas of the map, and it's almost always these low load areas that you cannot get to on the dyno. And let's say you had a manual transmission, so you've got a locked ratio between engine RPM and your wheel speed, and you do this on the flat. So same thing, 3,000 RPM part throttle, roll out of the throttle, it slows down. However, if you're now going down a slight hill, if you roll out of the throttle, it's going to maintain that 3,000 RPM. So now you're in a zone that you just couldn't get to on the dyno. And of course, we'll try and extrapolate our fuel and ignition numbers down into those sites we can't see on the dyno, but it's probably not going to be right. So for me, that was why I always, and I still do, try and confirm my tunes out on the road once I've been on the dyno. So I'll have everything, I'd say, it's going to be 98, 96% right. But then it allows me to just confirm those light load areas, make sure that my part throttle mixtures are exactly what I was seeing on the dyno. But I also quite often will see small fluctuations in the wide open throttle air fuel ratio, and maybe my boost targets aren't quite right. And I think this sort of comes down to, no matter how good the dyno is, it's very difficult to accurately replicate the airflow that we see at 100, maybe 150 kilometers an hour on the road in a dyno cell, and that changes things. Is that sort of your experience too?
Yeah, I agree. You might get a perfect on the dyno, and then on the road, your fuel mixtures are very different. So I do make sure that we road test them. And I'm not interested, to be honest, in so much the full power stuff on the road. I sort of tend to focus more on the power throttle. The last thing I need as a shop owner as well is to, get pinned in third gear with one of these things at 8,000 RPM. It's not going to be good. So I try to focus on the power throttle stuff. If I'm going to give it a little bit of a squirt on the road, I'll do it in a low gear, maybe second gear or something like that, just sort of coming onto boost just to make sure my fuel mixtures are correct. And then I'm sort of confident from there. I'll see a pattern. I'll see what they're doing. And if they're where they need to be, then I know the rest of it's going to be fine as well. But then obviously you have your added setup of the engine protection, closed loop control, which, you gives you that bit of extra safety as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's one of the advantages I've seen with the advances in technology and the ECUs, particularly around not controlling closed loop fuel control. I mean, a lot of people, I think, are using these instead of doing the job properly in the first place. The reality is that that's not what they're there for, but they're a safety backstop if your fueling's just a little bit off, or maybe customer gets a bad batch of fuel and it runs into a bit of knock.
Of course, it definitely helps.
The other element in terms of differences between the hub dyno and the rolling road. So I kind of started my career with a Dynapack hub dyno, which was a great product, but quite limited in terms of its torque handling capability as we started building more and more powerful engines. But people always argued that the rolling road, much quicker to get the car set up on the dyno than taking the wheels off, jacking it up and getting it onto a hub dyno. Then I started with HPA with a mainline four-wheel drive hub dyno, and I actually found, particularly for the high-powered cars, it was almost the complete opposite. Strapping them down properly, particularly so that the car was also going to get good traction, that would take me usually as much time as it would to put it on a hub dyno. And then the other element, you kind of touched on that, I found a lot of inconsistencies between the start of a tuning session when the tyres were cold, and you do maybe 10 ramp runs, the tyre's obviously going to get warm. That affects the power reading. The tyre pressure affects the power reading. Another real one that stuck out in my mind is a ZL1 Camaro that we were tuning for one of our worked examples. The tyres that were on it were basically through to the canvas. So I talked to the owner and said, hey, look, these tyres are no good. I don't want to risk having one blow out on the dyno. And we put new tyres on it. And just between those old rinsed tyres that were through to the canvas and the new set of tyres, there was something like about a 40 horsepower difference. So there's a lot of complexities there that I think people overlook, whereas on the hub dyno, the repeatability is far better. So for me, I think particularly if I'm developing a car over time for a customer, he's going to come back with that car in 6 months because he's made some other modifications. I don't want to be risking sort of chasing my tail with a 40 horsepower deficit, but the reality is because they've changed tyres. Again, do you sort of see similar situations?
No, I agree. Any development work we want to do, I do it on the hub for that reason, because you just can't get the repeatability. Someone will change the tyres up, put different wheels on it, different tyre pressures, this and that, even the way the bed's set up, the way it's strapped. There's too many variables to get an exact number each and every time.
Important to point out as well, this isn't knocking mainline. I believe that they make the best product out there. This is a situation you're going to see on every rolling road.
Yeah, exactly. We've got two mainline machines, so I'm over the moon with mainline.
All right, so in terms of tuning more powerful cars, let's jump into drag engines, which are one of my favourite topics to talk about. Really, I think as an engine tuner and an engine builder, this is where you really kind of get to prove what you're capable of, which unfortunately in street cars, the targets, the aims, what we're trying to achieve are very different, and that's not always the case. You're probably best known at this stage for JUNII, which is an R32 GT-R, which I believe at the moment we're recording this still holds the world record for the R32 GT-R, or GT-Rs in general.
Yep, it does. It's currently still got the world record for fastest GT-R, quickest and fastest GT-R, import radial, all-wheel drive. Can't remember what else, to be honest. I think there's about 6 or 7 of them it's got, to be honest. And that's still at 637 and 224 from memory. Right.
Okay. I mean, that's no joke. And before we started recording this as well, we talked about the fact this is still, I'm putting this in air quotes, but a street car. Yeah. How streetable is this package? Can you take it through the Macca's drive-through?
You know what? You actually could drive the car on the street, to be honest. It's still streetable in that respect. But I guess these days the cars are gone, they've got really small tanks now, this and that. So you're trying to keep the weight down. So that's really where your main limitation is in terms of cooling system. It's still got radiator. It's still got water going through the block. It's still got water going through the head. So there's no concerns on that side of it. It's mainly just a fuel tank capacity, to be honest.
So we're not talking here about a tube frame drag car with a carbon fibre body that can run for 400 metres and then has to be immediately shut down.
No, he drives it back. If he doesn't pull the chutes, he'll drive it back. After the 6.3 from memory, I think he drove back to the shop. The car is still drivable. It's still got a full chassis, no chassis connectors, nothing fancy done there. It's literally just got a 6-point cage, and that's pretty much it, to be honest. It really shouldn't be doing what it's doing. Yeah, when you look at what it's doing, and then if you have a look under the car, you'll just walk away scratching your head.
Now, I've got some personal involvement with GTR drag racing in that for a period of time back in my old business, I was involved with heat treatments here in New Zealand, and at the time I finished up with them, they held the world record for the GTR. I think that thing went as fast as 741 or something like that. And I remember tuning that car. I think we were around 1,400 wheel horsepower back at that point. And it ran with a Liberty air-shifted clutchless box. And if you had that thing set up on kill, it was sketchy watching Reese pilot that car down the track. And I mean, it was using both lanes some of the time. And I sort of looked at that and thought, well, how much more power can we actually put into it? And at that time, if someone had said 6.3 is possible, I said absolutely not. What is the difference that's got you over a full second faster than what the benchmark was at that point?
Yeah, obviously the first one being the horsepower side, things have progressed a lot in the whole RB development side of things. But I think the big thing, which is, I guess, made them get down in those sort of times and much more stable, is probably the transmission side.
Yeah, so you're running an auto there.
Yeah, it's running a Turbo 400. So the Turbo 400, obviously with the converter, you can spec your converter how you want it, but it does soften it up a lot. We see it with our high-end street manual cars, which, you got Go 32 and War GTR, both in the 7s. They're pulling gears and they're starting to get that heat treatments, changing lanes, want to change lanes sort of thing. And a lot of that is, I think, the gear, obviously with each gear change, you're unloading the suspension and that sort of thing as well. Then your power delivery is ramping back in. You want to keep that turbo speed up to keep that smoother, but at the same time, you're pulling the gear change. It's inevitably going to unsettle the car for a fraction of a second, which can cause the car to become a bit skaty.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly what we saw. It was on the gear shifts, which is when it wanted to move around. And as clutchless boxes don't need a torque reduction to allow the shift to complete, but of course when you go from second to third gear, the engine RPM still has to be pulled down by whatever that gear ratio change, maybe 800, 1200 RPM, and that's what kind of makes the car get a little bit skaty. So yeah, I mean I think,
and you don't have that sponge of a torque converter soaking it up and softening it up. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, I mean, every fast GTR these days is running a similar combination with the auto. In terms of a torque converter though, one of the problems we do see in a drag application is it can be hard to get the torque converter up on the stall with a small capacity engine and a big turbocharger. Basically, it doesn't make enough torque to actually drive the converter initially. So how are you getting around that? Are you using nitrous or anything to stall it up?
We use nitrous to get it up on stall. Some cars we leave it on, some cars you turn it off. I'm going to say pretty much all of them, it comes off. And then if we need the nitrous, we'll turn it back on coming down the track. So I like to only use the nitrous if we need it. If we don't need that extra horsepower, I try to use all the boost we can before we go, okay, let's turn the nitrous on.
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of the torque converter itself, how critical is that? And this is an area I haven't had much involvement with auto drag cars, but let's talk about the stall point for a start. What's that even mean?
Well, that's pretty much the stall of the converter. So what your stator combined with your cover and that sort of thing, when your converter actually starts locking up. So that's a bit of a tricky one as well, because every car, every driver likes their cars different. Every chassis can only take so much. So you're constantly evolving that. You go too loose, you won't go fast. And then you're going to hit the point where you start throwing power at it and you just don't have enough converter there. So you need to make a change on your stator or your cover. It depends on how you're going about your things. So it's constantly evolving. Each bit of horsepower you throw, you're going to need to tweak your converter.
Okay. The other element there with the torque converter is basically no matter what you do, there's always going to be some slip inherent in the converter. And by that I mean, 8,000 RPM into the converter from the crankshaft is going to be not 8,000 RPM coming out the other side. There's going to be some amount of slip. So generally, all things being equal, if we look at a manual gearbox versus an auto with a converter, generally for the same horsepower, the auto will be a little bit lower in mile an hour?
Yes, generally it will. A manual's always going to show a true horsepower, in the back end, but it won't necessarily make it a quicker car either. You might have a lower mile an hour, but a faster time, obviously, with the automatic.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, while the mile an hour is a nice bragging number, it's really the ET that drag racing's all about. So, I mean, if we can go quicker with a slightly slower mile an hour, we'll absolutely have at it.
Yeah, of course.
Let's come back to the engine, because that's obviously a big area that we've seen development across essentially all of the sport compact or import drag racing. Safe to assume here that you're running a billet block now?
Yes, we're running a billet block, still a wet block, but yeah, billet blocks now, they're obviously the go-to for anything making horsepower now.
What was the limitation essentially on the cast iron RB block? Where did you sort of start seeing them falling apart?
We went 720, I think it was 191, 192 with a cast block. That was sleeves, that was with an RD block. Still had water in it, so it was only half grout filled. We got as far as 720s, but then you just get to the point where the blocks are twisting. They don't have the rigidity. And then all of a sudden you start pushing water. And really our last thing would have been a GT-R festival. That was our last straw where we just gone, nah, it's too dangerous. Burst the bottom cooler hose because it lifted the head. And the car went sideways across the finish line. So we're like, okay, that's enough time to make the change. So we could have gone dry deck and left the cast, but I didn't feel there was any need to. To go to the next level, we've gone, you know what, we need to be alloy rods, because we were still running steel rods back then as well, and you wouldn't fit the alloy rods in the cast block unless you'd done some serious mods.
Yeah, I think that it's easy to overlook the safety element of going to a billet block. As you say there, you lift the cylinder heads, and for those who aren't understanding what we're talking about here, the cylinder pressure, when we start running huge power levels, lots of boost, the cylinder pressure can be enough to literally lift the cylinder head. Only needs to be a few thousandths of an inch, or flex it away from the deck surface on the block, and then combustion pressure can escape out to the head gasket, then into the coolant passages, and if that pushes water out, maybe it blows up a radiator hose or pushes out the header tank and gets under a tyre, well, it can be incredibly dangerous. So, yeah, there's some advantages there for sure. In terms of the block itself, there's a lot of combinations that people run in the RB world. If we look at the conventional cast iron block, there's the RB26 block, obviously. There's the RD block that you referred to, the diesel block. There's the RB30, which has become popular to get some more capacity. And then there's a variety of different rotating assemblies to get different capacity levels. What's your sort of go-to? What have you found works well to retain sort of the ability to still rev high, but maybe, if you've got a bit more capacity, a little bit more low-end torque and response?
We're running pretty much 99% of our builds. All the big ones these days are all billet block 3.2 litre Nitto kits, and they've released, I'm not sure if you're aware, the wide journal stroke kit as well. So you end up with a bearing which is 30% more wider than what the factory run is. So you end up with something that can take a bit more punishment as well. And that's pretty much our go-to these days, to be honest. Every big car we've got is running the 3.2 litre wide journal kit.
Okay. If we look at the block, the rotating assembly, etc., with that rotating assembly itself, the Nitto parts that you're using, have you found a sort of a limitation in terms of life expectancy on those parts or power handling capability?
At this stage, no. The only real limitations you got is with a drag extreme kit. You've got the aluminium rods. You've just got obviously your serviceability on the rods. How often you do them will really come down to what you put the car through as well.
Yeah, sure. So with those alloy rods, they are a consumable item. They will fatigue. So generally, if you don't replace them at the right intervals, you're going to end up having one break.
Yes, it can get ugly pretty quick.
From a tuning perspective, we see alloy rods being the sort of go-to option for most serious drag applications, and we can sort of get away with it in a drag application because you're not putting a lot of miles on the engine, obviously. So alloy rods in a street engine, not very common. From a tuning perspective and an engine reliability perspective, where is the advantage in that alloy rod over a steel rod?
You can throw a lot more horsepower at it, prolonged bearing life. It's a win-lose situation because you gain bearing life, but at the same time you need to replace your rods more often. So which are the better two evils? At this stage I'm probably going to say the aluminium rod, because you can still throw a lot more at it than what a steel rod can take. It behaves like a shock absorber pretty much, whereas a steel rod is a steel rod. There's no giving it. So with aluminium rod, it can take a lot more punishment, a lot higher cylinder pressures.
Yeah. So the downside with the steel rod is essentially there's no shock absorption effect with it. It will basically supply that shock loading from the cylinder pressure down through the piston, through the rod, and into the bearing. So you can end up hammering out the connecting rod big end bearings, correct?
Yes, correct. Obviously with aluminium rod, it's a softer material, so the rod takes more of the punishment than what the bearing does itself.
Yeah. All right, the other element that sort of always becomes problematic once the boost levels and cylinder pressure start to creep up is head gasket integrity. What have you sort of gravitated towards there in terms of head sealing technology?
We got obviously the firing setup, which we use with the copper gasket. We haven't had a head gasket issue since we've gone to a billet block, whether it be a full wet block or a dry deck block. We've never had a head gasket issue. The deck thickness obviously plays a big part in that as well. It's a lot thicker block. You got half-inch head studs which actually go down almost to the middle of the block, which does help in the integrity of the block itself. So you do minimise all your flex and that sort of thing as well, which plays a big part in, obviously, the head gasket integrity.
Definitely. In terms of the fact that you're still wet block there with this billet block, how does that work in terms of the water passing between the block and the head? Is it still coming through the deck surface, or are you doing this externally to keep it a dry deck and prevent problems if you did lift the head?
Yep, so on JUNII it's a dry deck, but a wet block. We still have the factory alternator on it, factory water pump, and we pretty much feed the water from the back of the block into the head itself and then come out through the front. So, and at least that way we're cooling the back of the head, cooling the whole head pretty much thoroughly and without any issues. So the factory water pump seems to be holding up pretty good, providing that cooling for us. So,
moving on to the cylinder heads, I'm assuming you're still dealing with what started life as a factory casting here?
Correct. Unfortunately, there's nothing else on the market. There's a few things sort of in the plans in the background, but to date, we're still using all the stock casting. So,
I mean, it's not a bad head as far as a high RPM, high boost performance application goes with the bucket style valve actuation. Are there any limiting factors with that cylinder head that are holding you back from making more power?
Pretty much the strength of it and the thickness of it, because once you open the ports up, if you open them up too much, you can start cracking heads in that as well. So it's a very fine line with how much you can open it up to make the horsepower you want to make, and then obviously keep the structural integrity of it as well.
So compromises are the name of the game?
Yes, unfortunately it has to be at the moment.
Is it safe to assume that at some point with the continued development of this engine that we're going to see someone come out with a billet head or an aftermarket cast head that kind of fixes some of these inherent problems?
Yeah, I think both options are on the cards because not everyone's going to go buy a billet head. The problem is with Nissan these days, they're charging that much for a core, and you can't even get them. You might have a 12-month wait for a new core these days, if you can even get them in 12 months. So it's pretty much, they've just about discontinued it. It's that bad at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it must be pretty close. I mean, it's probably still a benefit that you can actually still buy the stock castings. I mean, there's a lot of the cars of that generation around that age now that you just can't buy new bare castings from the manufacturers. So I guess you've got that advantage even if it is an expensive and long wait.
Yeah, unfortunately, you just got to put your order in and wait.
Yeah. Okay, let's come back to the rest of the package here. And obviously the engine's critical to support the power, but really it's the turbocharger that's the key to getting the airflow into the engine. What turbocharger are you running on at the moment?
We're running a Precision 110 on it.
Okay. And how has the turbo development sort of gone over the time you've been running the car? How did you start? Where did you start? And sort of...
We started with Promod 88. When we bought that turbo off the main Precision dealer in Australia, he looked at us and goes, "Where are you going? This turbo's too big. You're never going to get it up. You're never going to run out of turbo." Next thing you know, we went to the 91, then we went to the 94, then we went to the 98, and then from the 98, we just literally, I can't remember what happened. Something happened one day. I think we had an issue with the cylinder head, and then we pulled the 98 off, and we're going, you know what, stuff it, let's just put the 110 on it. So we put the 110 on. The 110 was actually meant to be for the Pro Mod. Then we ended up throwing that turbo on June. So it's pretty much gone from an 88 to a 110, and you're still looking for more turbo as well.
So I'm interested, what is the development path when you keep stepping up that turbo size? I mean, obviously the bigger turbo has the potential to make a lot more power, but again, coming back to that, you've got what is still a relatively small capacity engine. getting the thing to get up on the stool gets harder with a bigger turbo. So does it make it much harder to get the car to 60 foot to get off the line?
With the 110 was probably a noticeable difference from 98, because we went from 98, we skipped the 102, skipped the 106, and went straight to the 110. That was a fair bit different. So you got to be careful, obviously, trying to get the car out of the hole so it doesn't fall into a hole where it can't make the boost either. So it's a very fine line to make that work as well. That's where your torque converter comes into play as well.
On the same note, though, you start to get to those much bigger turbochargers. If you can get them to spool, maybe using nitrous, etc., lower in the RPM, I'm guessing you can end up getting yourself pretty dangerously close to running the turbo into surge. Is that a consideration or an issue with these bigger turbos?
We haven't had too much of an issue with them coming into surge, but yes, you are right. They can come into a bit of a surge slot, which you need to get over as well. So we haven't had too much of an issue with them surging though.
Okay. I mean, you're still quite a bigger capacity engine to some of the ones we see sort of anti-surge drive-by-wire throttle setups on, which are like of Colin Wilshire's Eclipse with the 4G63 in it. I mean, obviously it's a smaller capacity engine, so more prone to running into surge. On that note of surge, though, we see compressor maps from the likes of Garrett, Borg Warner, and there's a line on the left-hand side of the compressor map, which is the surge line. So you kind of know where you're going to be and when you're likely to run yourself into surge. Borg Warner, for example, have their MatchBot software where you can kind of plot your engine and find the compressor map that's going to suit it. Precision don't do this. No compressor maps. How much of a problem is it?
You know what? We've asked once, twice, 3 times, and you've got nowhere. You can't get them. I don't know if they've got them and they just don't release them or whatnot, but we've just gone, you know what? It's not a thing that we're going to get, so we don't look into it too much, if you know what I mean. Yeah, unfortunately, it's gotten to that because you can't get it. I look at it, if you can't control it, don't worry about it, sort of thing. You know what I mean?
I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't seem like it's being that much of an issue, because if you walk around any drag meeting, you're going to see plenty of precision turbos. So obviously it's working for a lot of competitors, but it is interesting that they don't release or maybe don't have these compressor maps, which is something that a lot of people do rely on.
I think surely they've got them and they just don't release them. They've got to have them. You'd expect them to have them.
I would have thought so. Do they give you any guidance in terms of maximum turbo speed or anything that you shouldn't step over if you want to keep that turbo alive?
We've asked the question and we've been told keep them under 110,000.
Okay, and you're obviously monitoring turbo speed in your package, so you can.
Yes, yeah, of course we do. Yeah.
How close are you running to that line?
We're still a fair bit off. The most I've seen is 106, but we're still off it, so it's not too bad.
All right. Let's talk about the actual numbers. So what power is this engine making? What boost pressure do you use to make that power? And what RPM are you revving it to?
Look, we haven't ran this car on the dyno since we had the 94 on a full tilt. So it's been a fair while since we've actually put on the dyno with what we're racing with at the moment and run it at that same power level. How much power? I mean, 224 mile an hour at that weight, it's got to be making upwards of 2,700. But like I said, we try not to do too much on the dyno. I feel they're under a lot more stress on the dyno than they are at the track. I prefer to see it on the track than actually waste it on the dyno.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll jump into that in a moment, but before we do, boost in RPM?
Boost in RPM. RPM we're everything to about. We've seen 11.4. We try to keep it around 11,000. Occasionally, Rob gets a bit happy and goes a bit more. Boost, we've seen 96, I think it was.
Oh, that's so dangerously close to...
Yeah, that's the most we've seen out of it. I was disappointed we didn't get 100 that time because I was pushing to try and get 100.
I like round numbers. I think I'd have done another run and just tried a bit more.
Yeah, we did try that, but like I said, we haven't run it with the 110 at that boost level. So with the 110, we haven't run it at that boost level yet. So we're actually struggling with the chassis more than horsepower at the moment and trying to get the car to utilise all the power it's got.
Yeah, it does become a bit of a balancing case when you're making this much power. I mean, everyone would think that, well, we want to go faster, just make more power, but that's fine if you can actually get it to the track. But if it's going up in wheel spin, you're not going anywhere, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
So you sort of go around in a bit of a circle, chasing chassis setup, improving the traction.
Yeah, and it's funny because you find sometimes the things that work for you when you were running, 7.5s, 8-sector passes, don't work when you start running 690s, but then all of a sudden the things that you need to do at 650s and under, you might sort of revisit a lot of those things as well. So what works at one power level doesn't necessarily work at another. But you can't rule that out either.
I just wanted to take a moment out of our interview with Con to talk about a tuning starter package that I think you're really going to enjoy if you've enjoyed our chat with Con, and maybe you want to go down a similar path and learn how to tune for yourself. And traditionally, this has been a difficult industry to break into, but we've made it as easy as possible. This package deal that we've put together includes essentially everything you need to know. It starts with our EFI Tuning Fundamentals course, and as its name implies, this teaches you the fundamentals of EFI tuning. You'll learn how the engine works, how it responds to fuel and ignition timing, and what we're actually trying to achieve when we are tuning the engine. From here, we'll move into our practical tuning courses, which gives you the option of choosing between our practical standalone or practical reflash tuning course. Standalone course, perfect for those of you who want to learn how to tune an aftermarket standalone ECU such as a MoTeC, Haltech, Link, or basically anything in between. The reflash tuning course, perfect for those of you who want to learn how to reflash or retune the factory fitted ECU that came equipped in your car, an increasingly popular method on late model cars. We're also including our Understanding Air-Fuel Ratio course, which is, in my opinion, probably one of the most misunderstood topics in the world of EFI tuning. You'll learn how the fuel delivery affects the engine operation. You'll learn some safe starting air-fuel ratios for a range of different engines, and then most importantly, you'll learn how to optimize the air-fuel ratio to suit your engine, your fuel, and your application. Coming back to that practical tuning course for a moment, both of those courses I mentioned are generic, so it doesn't really matter what engine or tuning platform you're learning to tune on. These courses will have you covered. And in both of those courses, we also present a simple, easy to follow, step-by-step process that you can apply to your particular tuning job. Once you've gone through that, it's going to ensure that you don't overlook any critical steps, waste time or waste money, or potentially end up skipping something that could end up damaging your expensive engine. Both of our practical courses also include a library of worked examples where you can watch that step-by-step process being applied on a wide range of different engines and different tuning platforms. Our starter package also includes 24 months of gold membership, which gives you access to our weekly live members webinars. If you can't watch live, you can watch our webinars in our archive. We've got over 300 hours of existing content, and this is a gold mine if you want to advance your performance automotive knowledge. You'll also get access as a gold member to our members only forum, which is the best place to get reliable answers to your specific questions. The total value of all of the courses in this package is over $870. It is normally $417, but you can use the coupon code Croydon100, and that's going to get you $100 off. So only $317. This is an amazing deal if you want to get stuck in learning how to tune. Even using that coupon code, you are still protected with our 60-day, no questions asked money-back guarantee, so absolutely zero risk getting involved. Let's get back to our chat with Con now. All right, let's come back to what you said about the use of the dyno and the fact that you're not running this thing sort of on kill on a tuning session on the dyno. I think most people listening would probably assume that you are running it on the dyno in exactly the same power level and tune up that you're using at the track. And you mentioned there that you find they're more stressed on the dyno. So what's your approach here? You're sort of getting a baseline and then tuning at the track?
Yeah, generally I like to get a bit of a baseline from the tune. Once I've got my fuel curve right, I know what timing figures we need to be at. We've obviously done a fair few of them now. So once we've got the fuel in where we want it, I'll probably go up to, depending on the car, anywhere between 50 and 65 pounds of boost sort of thing. And after that, I'll do the rest of the track. I find if you go too much, if it was a manual car, different story, you could probably run it a bit more comfortably on the dyno. But with the autos, you hear it flare up the converter, and the thing just sits on the converter because the way it ramps up is very different as well. So I try not to do too much, and when your converter's flaring up like that, it's putting a lot more stress on everything as well. So I'll get up to that 65, 70 pound mark and then just go, okay, let's do the rest of the track.
Yeah. So again, I think that will probably surprise a lot of people that you can actually tune an engine at this level at the track. Everyone would assume that the dyno is the only place that you can do your tuning. So what are you looking at when you're at the track in order to get that tune up where it needs to be? What's the sort of inputs and feedback that you're looking at?
Obviously your EGTs, your fueling, your lambda, that's your main thing. You start tuning at the track as well as your boost, obviously, but that's more power management side of things as well. So say I've run a car at 70 on the dyno, I might only go out and start at 45 or 50 the first run, just to make sure that everything's okay, and then just creep up on it sort of as we go along.
Again, as well, just coming back to the fact that you've probably got more power in a lot of places than you can actually put to the track if you've got this thing running, as much power and boost as it can. What is the element of dialing the tune-up in to suit the track conditions? Because again, this track is always going to be different from one day to another. Even during the day, the track will evolve.
The main thing we obviously chase at the track is the power management side of things. The tune-up, once the tune-up's done, it's going to be pretty close to where it needs to be. If it's running a little bit richer, I won't try to chase it too much unless you're trying to extract every last bit of horsepower out of it. Unless it's running lean and you need to add some more fuel, you won't really touch your fueling side of things. Your timing's already set. You don't need to play with the timing. Your main thing you're chasing is really your power management, which enables you to obviously utilize the power that you've got.
So in terms of power management, you're really talking about how much boost pressure you're using down the track?
Yes, how much boost pressure you're using down the track and where you're bringing the power in, what you're taking off at, and that sort of thing.
Okay. All right, so in terms of that as well, obviously with these big turbochargers, there's a lot of inertia in the turbo, the wheel size, there's just a lot of mass there. So I've found that changing boost targets very, very quickly, the turbo just can be a little bit lazy to come up and change. So there's other techniques that can be used to modify the torque delivery as well, such as pulling timing to reduce torque instead of reducing boost, so that way when you get to a point where you can use all of the boost, you don't need to wait for that turbo to sort of spool up and the boost to increase. Do you do anything like that?
We have played a little bit with the timing side of things, but the cars, I guess for us, are that on the edge, especially with the big turbochargers like that. Sometimes if you pull a bit too much timing out as well, you can actually start generating boost as well, which increases horsepower as well. So we find probably the most important and most efficient way for us to do it is through the boost control. So we really got to make sure our boost control is on point to make sure that the power's coming in where we want it. It seems to pretty much hit our targets where we want it, so we don't have that issue.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that boost control. What are you using there and how are you varying it down the track? Is this based on speed, gear, time, all of the above?
So we're doing it over time. That seems to be the most consistent for what you're doing down the track, down the drag strip. So we're not doing a gear dependent or anything like that. It's all time based.
Okay. And CO2 boost control?
No. We've developed a system in the MoTeC package that we've done, and we're doing a lot of our boost control through the drive-by-wire.
Okay, interesting. Talk to us more about how that's working then.
Very good. It's working very good. So we've obviously got a closed-loop system developed in our package, which enables us to run the boost where we want it, and it also enables us to keep the turbo speed where we want it as well.
Right, so instead of a hot side boost control, you're using a drive-by-wire throttle on the cold side plumbing. Is that what I'm picking up here?
Correct.
Okay. Any hot side boost control at all? So is it run a wastegate at all or no?
Some do, some don't. In this application, actually most of the applications at the moment still run a wastegate. So we've got some other things we're doing there as well, but our main boost control is through the drive-by-wire.
Right. What would you say is the advantage over a conventional hot side boost control?
The advantages over a hot side boost control? Well, to be honest, we haven't run a generic hot side boost control on something like this before. So usually at this level, you run CO2. And I just find our control with this over the CO2 is much better. We've got this dialed in pretty well. We've spent a fair bit of time on the control system to make sure that it's where it needs to be for what we're trying to do. And it pretty much hits our target when we want it.
I mean, I guess that kind of comes back to what I was saying before with these bigger turbos and the inertia. They don't tend to change boost in a split second, but the way you're controlling it, they're bleeding off the boost pressure from the cold side. As you mentioned, you're actually maintaining that turbo speed. So if you need more boost and you shut that drive-by-wire throttle quickly, it's just going to jump straight to your boost target, isn't it?
Pretty much. But then it's a lot you got to spend a lot of time obviously on your control system to make sure then it chases what you want without overshooting and carrying on as well. So it's a complex system, but it works. It works pretty well. And I think we've got the best computer to do it. Rsport, who we've been working with, who write our packages for us, we work pretty close in what we do, and it's a good system we've developed together.
Yeah, sure. In terms of the boost pressure from the time you're on the two-step limiter or launch control through to running through the traps at the end of the track, what sort of the boost start to finish? You already talked about the finish, but what are you at the start of the run, and how quickly can you ramp that up?
Depending on the car, depending on track, you could start as low as 15 pounds. Depends on the whole setup, to be honest. Every car's a bit different. I've never found two cars to be exactly the same. You could have two identical setups and they both want something different. You will never have them both the same.
Another element with the launch, because this is really so critical to getting a good ETM mile an hour, is getting the car to 60 foot really, really well. And this comes down to matching the power delivery to the grip that the track has. We've already talked about the fact that that's sort of a constantly changing target as well. With the controls that you've got available, I'm guessing here you've got the ability to control the boost pressure on the start line as well as the launch RPM. What's the balance between changing one or the other or both of those together? What do you go to first?
Generally, look, depends on the turbo setup. Depending on the size of the turbo is where you will sort of try pick your RPM, because obviously a smaller turbo you can take off a less RPM, which will shock the tyre less. So what we're doing, a lot of our stuff is predominantly IRS based. We don't have that ability to separate the suspension like a live axle and hit it too hard. So we have to obviously finesse that side of it. The RPM would depend on the turbo. Obviously, the larger the turbo, the higher in the RPM you're going to need to go, because you don't want the car to fall into a hole either. And if it falls into a hole, then you won't be able to make the boost that you want to make. So it's a balance between both, depending on the car, the setup, and the track.
Yeah. All right, we're going to get into the electronic side of thing, and this sort of feeds into the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is the four-wheel drive system with the R32 GT-R, because this is quite unique in that the car is predominantly rear-wheel drive, and you've got a hydraulic center differential that you can essentially lock up or open to transfer drive to the front wheels. And I mean, I think when I got into drag racing years and years ago, I kind of naively thought that four-wheel drive was a big advantage. I mean, the reality is obviously the fastest drag cars in the world are all rear-wheel drive. These GTRs are launching with the front wheels in the air anyway, so I'm guessing there's not a lot of benefit from the front-wheel drive element, at least initially. For a start, how much of a benefit is that four-wheel drive system in your opinion?
Believe it or not, the car will not take off if the four-wheel drive isn't on. It's on, the front wheels are in the air, the front wheels are doing nothing, but the car needs it on. The whole power delivery changes as well. The whole characteristics of the car change. We have tried at some point when we had an issue with the front diff to go, let's put in rear-wheel drive, and we had to pull out so much power and the car still wouldn't take off the same way.
Wow, interesting.
The whole characteristics change of the car as soon as you turn that front-wheel drive off.
Okay. In terms of how much torque you can transfer to the front wheels, again, with that center differential setup, you could vary that as the car goes down the track. Is this something you're doing, and is the benefit to that?
Look, it is something we're doing, and it's something that you have to do, to be honest. You can apply up to about 50% throttle. So if you lock a transfer case, you'll get a 50-50 split front and rear. How much you bleed it off, how quick you bleed it off, depends on the track and the characteristics of the car. If you've got too much four-wheel drive as well, you can have the car pulling from the front, which makes it a lot harder for the driver as well. But then it's a fine line between how much can you pull out before it actually breaks out in the wheel spin, or where can you pull it out. So you're sort of chasing that a bit depending on your track as well.
Yeah, okay. With that four-wheel drive split, is that something that you've sort of developed to a point where it's fit and forget and you don't touch it and you're using those other power delivery management controls that we've talked about to dial the car into the track, or is that another element that you're actually changing depending on the track and the day?
You always revisit it. At some point, you're always going to revisit it. It's, what might be working for you, like I said, at 680 mark doesn't necessarily work at 660. You need to make a change. And then what works at 660 doesn't work at 640s. You have to constantly change that around a bit to get that where you want it. You don't want to upset the balance of the car too much when you do it, but at the same time, it is something that does need to be revisited every now and then as well.
Yep. Let's move into the electronics. You've already mentioned MoTeC and the fact you're running a custom firmware package. Can you kind of give us a quick overview of what that actually means, the custom firmware?
So these days, your M1-based ECUs, they've got their fixed packages that they come with. So you've got your GPR, your GPRP, your GPR drag, and the control systems in that are limited to what MoTeC have allowed you to do. That's not what the ECU is capable of. It's what MoTeC has allowed you to do pretty much. You might want a different axis on one control table versus another, or vice versa, something like that. We have been developing a fair few packages over the last 4 or 5 years. Pretty much all our cars now are running on our own packages. So we've got the Pro Mod on our own package, which is that's a Pro Mod package. Then we've got the GT-Rs with Pete's and June. They're on like a Pro GT-R package, a Pro Drag GT-R package. And then we've got Glenn's GOAT 32 War GT-R on the GPRP Pro Street. So it's like a Pro Street paddle shift package. And then we've got all our other ones on our Pro Street package, which pretty much everything from JUNII filtered down into all the other cars. And then we've developed stuff on other cars, which has then gone up into JUNII as well, and vice versa. So we've got some done for the Evos as well, an Evo 8 one and an Evo 10 one, which we're currently testing. The Evo 10 one is pretty much the last one we're up to at the moment. And a lot of them, we sort of haven't marketed it too much because I'm sort of the belief we want to get the packages in the cars running, tested, proven, and then sell them. For us, it's not about developing something to go, hey, let's just sell it and, we're not fussed if this doesn't work, that doesn't work or anything like that. We want to make sure everything's right before we go, hey, this is available if you want to buy it, sort of thing.
Yep, that makes sense.
So we're developing it for our cars, and there might be control systems in there which other people don't want to use or they're not interested. They don't want to use all that stuff. So, but it's there ready to use if someone does.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of personal preference that comes into how you want to set up the electronics for an application like this. It's obviously a very specific application and everyone's got a different view on how to do things. But the benefit of the way that M1 system works is if you want to write your own firmware, you can basically have that ECU do just about whatever you want. And I'm guessing, as far as I'm aware at least, the drive-by-wire boost control is not a function that's natively available in any of the production firmware. So you've had that added in, plus the built-in control for that center differential that doesn't exist in a production firmware package?
Yes, correct. So a lot of that stuff is all written in. And sometimes what works in your head doesn't work at the track. So in June, for example, in the Pro Mod, and then we've got George's VL as well, we've left those as build packages with development licenses, so we can constantly tweak them while we're at the track if we need to, and we're not limited to what the package has to offer, sort of thing. So it's pretty much whatever you can think of. You think you want to do something a certain way, then you try it. That's it. It really comes down to how good your imagination is, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. All right, in terms of what you're monitoring on the engine, you did mention, I think, EGT. The other option there is individual cylinder lambda. A lot of people do use that. It's a bit more complexity in adding that. Anything like that going on? Are you monitoring coolant system pressure, crankcase pressure, anything else to sort of keep an eye on when you're looking at data analysis?
We've obviously got we've got sensors pretty much everywhere you can think of. We love sensors. The more we can put on the car, the better, the more data. And, it's not, you won't use them all the time, but when you do have an issue, you've got the answers there. And that's what it's about. It helps you fast track something when you do have an issue somewhere or when you're trying to find out something. No individual lambdas. We run the one lambda in the dump pipe. And then we've obviously got the individual EGTs as well. All
right. So those individual EGTs, I kind of find them or sort of explain them as being useful for two elements. One is we can do a degree of individual cylinder fuel trimming to equalize the EGT. Then we can also kind of monitor the overall EGT and make sure that we're within sort of safe limits. So the question there comes two parts. First of all, with that engine, how much individual cylinder trimming are you finding is required to sort of get those EGTs within sort of approximately the same values?
Look, I think anything, you might have 5 to 8%. Sometimes a little bit more. You certainly shouldn't need to be adding 20% of fuel on one cylinder. If you do, you've got an issue somewhere. But it depends on the injectors as well. So every car's a bit different. The injectors obviously a bit different, whether they're flow matched, if they're not. And then you obviously got, the airflow through your manifold, which affects that as well. So you want to sort of try keep them more. We get the EGTs going down the track probably within 20 degrees. So we get them pretty close.
For clarity there, we're talking Fahrenheit or C?
Celsius.
Yeah, okay, cool. Obviously, a lot of our American market will be working in Fahrenheit, so it's just important to get that clarity. 20 degrees, I think, is probably a reasonably tight region. Obviously, there's no need to necessarily sort of chase your tail trying to get these absolutely perfect. And just as a sort of a little caveat to that as well, I mean, we had one of our test engines that had individual cylinder EGT as well as individual cylinder lambda. And it's quite interesting to note that when the EGTs are equalised, it doesn't always actually result in perfectly equal air fuel ratios. So there's a few elements going on there, but I mean, if you've got EGT, obviously that's what you're going to rely on. In terms of safe limits on methanol fuel, could you give us some guidance into what you consider to be sort of the maximum EGT you're happy to see?
Look, for us, we'll see, up to about 700 C, 700, 720. We sort of try to keep it under around there. Sometimes in the back end of the track, depending on how much nitrous you're using, whatever else, you might creep up a little bit. But we've never lost a motor with them going up to those sort of temperatures. So we try to keep it, again, on the safe side of things to make sure that we don't have an issue there. It's hard enough as it is, let alone when you're trying to lean on it unnecessarily somewhere else. Do you know what I mean?
The flip side of this is if we compare those numbers to pump gas, that would be incredibly cold for a pump gas turbocharged engine, wouldn't it?
Yeah, correct.
What would be more typical in a drag application if you were on pump gas?
On a pump gas, I have seen up to 1100 Celsius, which is pretty hot. We won't see that often. When we have lent on cars before, I've seen 1070, 1080. Usually they'll be around the 900 though. But the highest I've seen is 1080, and we didn't hurt anything at that. That was actually a PB pass and a record pass, that one as well. So,
and that's sort of also getting into the realm of watching the sort of reliability of the turbine side of the turbo as well, depending on the actual specifics of the turbo, sort of around that 1050, maybe 1100 C. That's kind of about where a lot of turbos will start falling apart, right?
Yeah. So we definitely didn't like seeing those numbers. But sometimes when you're at the track and the customer wants to push to, get a record, or you're so close to something, sometimes you have to lean on it a bit more and do what you have to do to get it. So in this case, we did. But like I said, I've only seen that a handful of times, those sort of numbers. Generally, like I said, it's around that 900 mark, give or take a little bit.
Yeah. In terms of other differences between, let's say, just keep it to methanol and pump fuel, again, if we're running on pump fuel, generally we find that if we're on the dyno, it's going to make maximum power when we're sort of, as we lean it out from a rich starting point, we sort of see more and more power. Obviously at a point we're going to get our EGTs are too high, or go too lean, it'll start falling over as well. But there is that very distinct tie-in between our lambda target and the power the engine's producing. Methanol, I find, not quite so sensitive to that, and it tends to run quite happily, much richer, without really losing a lot of power, as long as you've got an ignition system that can light it off reliably. So on that note, what's your main guide when you're tuning? Are you looking more at your maximum EGT, or are you using lambda?
I'll use both. I found the lambda sensors on methanol at those really high mixtures as well aren't all that reliable. Obviously, you start reading pretty rich, so it's hit and miss with them. Sometimes you look at your lambda and you go, okay, your lambda's sort of 6.5 or 6.8 or whatever it is, and your EGTs are reflecting that. Then other times you see it at those mixtures and your EGTs aren't reflecting that. So it's like, okay, sometimes you go, I'm not even going to look at the lambda, I'm going off EGTs. And other times you reference off both. And got to make, a bit of a calculated decision on what you're seeing and how the car's behaving as well.
I think just coming back to our earlier conversation about running the car on the dyno versus running at the track, that's another thing that I see. I never went into the sixes, but what you'd see on a short pull on the dyno through one gear, that's loading the engine up differently than running the car the whole way down the strip, which might be under high load for 8 or 9 seconds. And the ultimate EGT that you see at the end of the track can be quite different to what you see on the dyno. Is that something you see as well?
Yeah, of course. So the EGTs you see on the track are definitely going to be hotter than what you see on the dyno, on a full pass at least anyway. On the dyno, you might do a pull. We don't ramp them up too aggressively. I try to keep some load on them to get my tune where it needs to be. The horsepower figure for me means nothing. It's just a tuning tool. We look at it to get the tune where we want it. Once it tunes where we want it, it makes what it makes. We'll do the rest of the track sort of thing. But 9 out of 10 times we get to the track and our fuel mixtures are pretty close to where they need to be. But like I said, As you go down the track, the longer you're in it, obviously your EGTs are going to get higher as well. So the last, 300 feet on the track is where your EGTs will really start climbing a bit.
Yep. Yeah, that's where you're going to start hurting the engine ultimately.
Correct.
All right, what about in terms of ignition timing? On methanol fuel, is knock a consideration? Obviously on pump gas, it's something we need to be very, very mindful of, making sure that the engine isn't running into knock. But the properties of methanol fuel are very different. How do you approach that side of things? Can you tune to MBT, or are you purposely being conservative?
You need to be conservative. You can't always tune to MBT. Obviously, we look a lot at the motor itself when it comes apart to see what's going on that side of it. Sometimes you might be able to add that, 1 or 2 degrees more, and the car will make, a shitload of horsepower extra as well. So it does like it, but do the internals like it with that extra cylinder pressure? That's another story. You know what I mean? So you're always trying to find that balance between what the motor wants, what it can actually take to make the power reliably as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. For those who maybe haven't heard that term MBT as well, just quickly explain that. It stands for maximum brake torque timing, or minimum timing for best torque, depending who you talk to. And basically, if we could plot a relationship between our ignition timing and our engine torque under one operating condition, as we start from very retarded timing and advance it, we see the torque increase quite dramatically. Then once we get to sort of the sweet spot where the engine is making maximum torque, that starts to plateau. Obviously it peaks eventually, and then if we continue to advance the timing beyond that point, we'll start to see that torque drop away again. So I mean, if we want to get the maximum torque the engine can make, MBT timing is where we want it, but obviously that comes with additional cylinder pressure, as you mentioned, that can have a detrimental effect in terms of the life expectancy of the engine components. Now, on the same note, we can also use torque manipulation via our boost control and via our ignition timing to actually limit the peak cylinder pressure through the peak torque area. And sometimes we're going to end up running a drag car past peak torque. So is that something you're doing as well, or is it not really a consideration with the strength of the engine components?
You're still doing it on some cars. On JUNII, I'm not going to really say you're limiting it because of the engine side of things. You're limited more on the traction side. But there are some motors where, the thing's trying to make that much power down low and in the mid-range that you don't want it. You don't want to make that power necessarily. So you will end up manipulating your boost curve to reflect something that's actually going to make the motor more happier and a much more progressive linear power curve, which helps keep them alive. I found the more responsive the setup, the more you want to do that as well.
I mean, I think it's good you raise this because, again, people probably think that it's a case of, well, let's give it all the timing that the engine wants and make as much power as the engine can produce. But the reality is a little bit more complex than that, right?
Yes, so there might be some cases where, I know I can put more timing in, and E85, people can get caught out with it as well, where you start adding time and things making more and more horsepower. It doesn't mean the motor likes it. People get caught up in the numbers. I get cars where, let's say, for example, at 5,000 RPM, a customer wants, 25, 30 pounds of boost. I'm looking at it going, what do you want 30 pounds of boost at 5,000 RPM for if the things are over 8? So I try to limit that bottom end torque through boost and timing to make that motor live, because obviously with the RBs, we know they're synonymous for having bearing issues if you get a bit too happy with them as well. So you want to keep that side of it more conservative, and then obviously ramp that into, obviously depending on where your maximum power output is as well, depending on what the car revs to. So it's all relative to what it revs to. I mean, if you're talking 5,000 RPM, you're only revving it to 7, a different story. You need some power there. It's relative.
Okay. In terms of reliability of the engine, we've already talked about the fact that the conrods are a consumable item, but what's the life expectancy of the rest of the components in terms of the rotating assembly, maybe valve train? How often is it coming apart? How many passes? And then when it does, what components are being replaced?
At this stage, the heads are probably the most thing that are giving us trouble with cracking and that sort of thing, and just struggling to cope with what we're trying to put them through. Then the rods, after that, your crank, we haven't really had any issues with. And pretty much, the pistons, no issues. We've never lost a piston over something stupid. So it's pretty much, if there's ever been a failure, it's from a rod. And maybe we've pushed it too long and haven't changed them when we needed to. When we first got into the alloy rods with JUNII, that was sort of our first bit delving into that whole alloy rod scene. So it was a bit of a learning curve for us as well. And I guess slowly we've just been going, okay, let's check it at 10 passes, let's check it at 15. And slowly we'll run it out a little bit more and assess the internals as well when they come apart to see how they're coping. And then you sort of get an indication. But then if you start having other issues in the meantime, then they obviously take life out of the rods as well.
Yeah, definitely. All right. One element I should have talked about when we were going over the electronics is with the MoTeC ECU, like most ECUs, you've got the ability to have closed loop fuel control where the ECU is correcting the fueling if you're not quite on your lambda target. I know some tuners absolutely love this and will run on every car. Other tuners don't like it in case maybe there's a sensor fault or something like that. Is that something that you're utilising?
We were not utilising it up until recently on the big power stuff. Nowadays, you might use it a little bit, but I have it there more as a fail safe. So I don't want it to trim fuel out personally. I'd rather trim the fuel out myself. And if it needs a little bit of extra fuel, it's got the ability there to add it there if it does need it. At least it gives you a little bit of a safety buffer. But again, I don't rely on it.
Yeah. I mean, the benefit here, I sort of mentioned earlier, this isn't a sort of a Band-Aid that lets you do a shoddy job of tuning. It's there to pick up the pieces if things aren't quite right. But the nice element is with the MoTeC, like a lot of closed-loop systems, is you can also limit the amount of control it has. So, maybe if it's a street car, for example, you might want to allow plus or minus 10 or 15% down in the idle and cruise areas. But when it's up on full load, you could maybe pull that down to plus or minus 3 or 5% so that it's much tighter control. And I mean, at the end of the day, it shouldn't be doing that much trimming realistically if you've done your job properly in the first place, right?
Yeah, correct. So like last car we had out, for example, last time we were out, there was at one point maybe one or two of the passes, there might have been 1% it was adding somewhere. So you just go and add that into your fuel trim, into your fuel itself, and then you'll pretty much see your fuel trim at zero the whole way. And if it's a tad richer, it's a tad richer. We'll leave that up to us to make the call rather than trying to rely on the electronics.
The other element with the electronics is traction control. And obviously there's a variety of ways that this can be done. Are you using any form of traction control on the car?
No, not with what we're doing because we're playing with a radial that doesn't like to turn at all. So the second there's wheel spin, our guys are getting off it anyway. You can set up obviously a traction curve above that once you've got the data, just to give you a bit of a fail-safe. But in saying that, we've never sort of relied too much on that as well. An anti-lift sort of thing that you might try chase rather than traction control.
Yeah. And the other problem with a lot of people I talk to with these very high-powered engines is the traction control on paper is a great idea, but once you start introducing ignition cuts to these very highly tuned engines, that in itself can actually be a reliability problem for the engine, right?
Yes, it does definitely put a lot more load on the motor. The rods you'll find start copping that a lot more. So we try to sort of stay away from ignition cuts and that sort of thing on something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Also, intercooling. I'm not actually sure if you're running an intercooler on this car.
Yes, we're running a water-to-air.
Okay. I'm interested in your experience on this front because methanol in itself has got a great cooling property. Its latent heat of evaporation tends to draw a lot of heat out of the combustion charge as it goes through a phase change from liquid to vapor. So you see a lot of boosted methanol engines without an intercooler. Have you tried with and without? And basically, why did you decide the intercooler is right for this application?
We have tried with and without. Cold or air charge, you'll make more horsepower, plain and simple. That's the way we sort of look at it anyway. We did find that you needed to use a lot more boost to make the same horsepower than what you're doing with an intercooler versus without. You can get your intake temps obviously pretty cool with the water-to-air, depending on the core setup and how much ice you put in, the speed of the water, that sort of thing, or the water pump. So you can play around with that to sort of get that where you want it to an extent. But we definitely have noticed a big difference with no cooler and without. With a cooler and without, sorry.
Okay, yeah. Could you put a number around it in terms of how much horsepower the intercooler is worth?
Look, it's hard to put a number on it, but what I can say is for us the best reference is we went 6.3 at 224 with nitrous, At the moment, we've done a 6.5, a 222 without nitrous. So with the same turbo setup, just with a cooler and with a water-to-air cooler and without the water-to-air cooler. So there is been a fair horsepower gain there. And again, it's just about now actually having the chassis to utilise that horsepower, because we're sort of at the crossroads now where we're struggling to be able to use what we have with what we've got.
Yeah. That sort of segues nicely into where do you see this ending? 6.3 on one hand is dangerously close to a 5, but also for those who are operating at that level, those 0.3 of a second, that's a lifetime to get out of the car. What do you think realistically you can get this down to?
Honestly, there's no limit. The limit is how far each person wants to push. What's one thing we've learned, I guess, over the years, you can't really put a limit on what we're doing because technology is evolving. There's new stuff coming out. You're learning as you go on. So no one's done what we're doing. So you're constantly evolving and trying to better yourself. Is there a possibility that can run 5s? Yeah, I think so. Is it going to be hard to get there? Hell yeah. It's definitely not going to be easy. I don't think we'll do it in the chassis that we've got, but there are a few other cars coming out which I think are going to be a fair few steps forward on what we're dealing with at the moment.
Sure. In terms of that, how useful or helpful is it with advancing the GTR drag scene to have the competition? I mean, in Sydney, there's CRD and MoTeC who have been sort of trading blows. Obviously you always want to have the record, but would you be trying as hard if there weren't other tuners basically chasing you down?
Definitely not. Definitely not. A lot of it is the competition that we're doing, that we've got between each other. If we didn't have this competition, there's no chance we would have progressed as far as we've progressed. The thing is, when you've got the record and someone goes a bit quicker, then you're trying to chase them down, and then vice versa. So the chase is good. We enjoy the chase. So hopefully they come out and actually beat our 630 so we can push a bit harder and try to better it again. So we're always looking to keep evolving and keep trying to go faster, but you need that competition to give you that extra motivation and bragging rights sort of thing.
Definitely, yeah, and I think it's just good for the spectators as well. Everyone wants to see close competition. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Croydon Racing Developments in general. We haven't really sort of dived into the business, so give us a 30,000 foot view. Where are you? What's the size of the business, size of the facility, and number of staff?
So we're in Smithfield at the moment, so not in Croydon anymore. Jim was back in Croydon up until I think 98. Then they moved to Silverwater. Then from Silverwater, I moved to Rydalmere. And then in 2017, me and Omar took over. And then we moved to Smithfield, I think it was 2019, a couple of years later. We're on about 1,600 square metres, so floor space about 1,600. There's 9 guys on the floor, plus myself and Omar. In total, then you've got office staff, which is Andre, and then obviously our accounts lady. So in total, there's be about 13, 14 of us here.
Okay, it's a big operation. What's the sort of range of services that you offer? Is it just absolutely anything performance-based?
Pretty much. It comes and goes in waves. So we do obviously a lot of GTRs, a lot of Skylines. We also play with Evos. We play with V8 stuff as well. So we've got a bit of everything, to be honest, and it comes and goes in waves. You might not see an R35 for a month, and then all of a sudden, like I come back from the track the other day, it was a couple of weeks ago, I get back from the track and there's another 535s here. Okay. It's like, okay, what just happened? Everything comes and goes in waves. So we don't limit ourselves to one make or one model. We do a bit of everything. So we got Evo 10, which we're playing around with now, just waiting for a transmission for it to get that out and go have some fun with that.
Okay. Interesting. In terms of choosing a model or a make to support, what's the process sort of you go through when you're looking at, a new car comes out? How do you sort of rate initially what you think is going to be popular and what's worth supporting and learning that new platform?
I think a lot of it comes down to what type of vehicle it is and what the vehicle has to offer and what people like. We purchased a Nissan Z to do some development work on that.
This is the new 400Z?
Yes. So we've purchased that. Now that I don't feel that's really taken off yet because there hasn't been that many. There's actually not that many out yet. So a lot of people are struggling to still get their hands on them. But I think that's a decent platform. Being a 3-litre twin turbo V6, so it's got the engine. It's rear-wheel drive, which people like. I don't feel like there's been a rear-wheel drive turbo car since the 200SX on the JDM side of things.
Yeah, they sort of died a natural death almost.
Yeah, so it's, for me, I saw that as an opportunity going, hold on, this can be the next sort of 200SX sort of thing to hit the scene. So, and I think it will be to an extent in the future, but I think it will take a bit to sort of get there as well.
Okay. In terms of your customer base, what's the main element? Obviously, today we've talked predominantly about drag racing, but what's the main sort of interest that your customer base have? Is it drag racing? Is it roll racing? Is it circuit racing? Or is it predominantly street cars?
We do a bit of everything, to be honest, other than drift. We don't do too much in the drift side of things. Every now and then you'll get one come in, but not all that much there. But we've got the circuit cars that we work with. There's, I think, 4 or 5 of them here at the moment, which we support and build. Then you've got obviously your drag side of things, and then you've got your street side of things. These days, the street side of things is borderline drag. The roll racing side is starting to pick up, but in saying that, I try to sort of steer the guys into, our customers at least, into picking which one they want to do, because you get a lot of guys that want to go to the drag strip on Wednesday and then go to roll racing on Friday. They're two different things in terms of how the cars are set up. So if they're going to focus on roll racing, I prefer they just focus on roll racing rather than try to jump between the two. Like we went there with Go 32 one meeting, and to the roll racing, the car was all over the place. So it needs some serious changes to make it work.
Is that down to the fact that the roll racing, you're not dealing with a prepped surface with VHT down?
You're not dealing with a prepped surface, and also the power delivery is very different. On the drag strip, you're taking off from a standing start. The car's got acceleration straight away, whereas at the roll racing, you're cruising at a certain speed, and then you'll take off from there. So you've got this sudden rush of power, which can unsettle the car as well.
All right. Let's move on towards wrapping this thing up, Con. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've got the same 3 questions we finish up with all of our guests. The first of those, what's next in the future for you and CRD? Maybe look into your crystal ball and tell us what it looks like in 5 or 10 years' time.
Mate, to be honest, we're just looking at growing and expanding, and I guess playing with more platforms as well on the racing side of things. We just want to keep growing. That's our main focus. So we've got a big facility here, which we've sort of invested heavily into, and we'd like to utilise it to its full potential.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself, or maybe one of our listeners, to help get to where you've got to in your career faster, or maybe potentially avoid some pitfalls that you've come across along the way?
Honestly, just pay attention, listen to what seniors have to say, and any opportunity you can get to learn, take it. It's not all about money. These days there seems to be, how can I put it, a preconception that, you know, if someone wants to learn, they need to get paid to learn. Man, I've done so much in my own time to, I guess, put myself where I am and to learn from others. And I think a lot of that has gone away these days. So I think if really just apply yourself and concentrate and learn and take everything in you can off everyone.
I think it sounds like you're very fortunate with the early part of your career being able to sit alongside Jim, the old owner, and learn from his experience in tuning. Is that sort of what has set you up for what you're doing now? Yes,
it has. But a lot of it is, how can I put it, I think a lot of it is how you apply yourself as well and learn. I mean, I remember being 18 years old and sitting at the shop till 2, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, you know, trying to help get cars ready. Now, I didn't need to be there, but I wanted to be there to learn. I wanted to be a part of it. I think that mentality is changed over the years between a lot of people, between the generations. So, there's a lot of opportunities for people to put themselves in that position, but I think you've just got to embrace it and want to learn. I keep saying, in this industry, I think to be successful, you need common sense and commitment and passion. If you've got the commitment and passion, and you've got common sense, you can make it work.
Yeah, I think that's really solid advice. I think the passion is so important. I don't think you're going to make it as well in this industry if you are just treating it as a job because it's going to make you money. I think there's probably not too many people in the tuning industry that have got there without that passion element. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just going to make everything so much easier. The other element there you sort of touched on is like learning from others. I think I probably was guilty of this in my earlier days of tuning. You sort of get to a point, I think it's a bit of the Dunning-Kruger effect coming in. You kind of start knowing nothing, build up a little bit of experience, and all of a sudden you think you know everything there is to know. And I think then the further you go through your career and the more you learn, the more experience you gain, you suddenly start questioning just about everything and realize that there's so much that you didn't even know that you don't know. So always keeping an open mind, learning from others. If you can get a mentor, absolutely great. Last question for today, Con. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, reach out to CRD, how are they best to do so? What are your sort of social media, websites, etc.?
Our website's currently under production. We actually got to get a move on that to get that sorted. These days, it's mainly social media. Social media is the biggest: Facebook, Instagram. Pretty much all the stuff we do is on there. Obviously, you can email us. The main parts of contact, though, are social media these days. So a lot of what we do is on there, but there's also a lot of what we don't. A lot of what we do also isn't on there because we just get so caught up in what we're doing every day that it's hard to sort of to keep track and try to put everything online these days as well. So
yeah, definitely. Keeping up with the social media is a full-time job in and of itself.
It is, unfortunately. So it's at the point where you almost need to put someone on full-time just to do your social media because there's so much here. I mean, we had Larry Chen, Throttle, and, Sakamoto-san come past, and a couple other people from overseas as well. And they've just walked in the shop and they're going, man, we've got so much content here. Why don't you show it? It's like we get too caught up in working and being in it. Sometimes you forget about it as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It always takes twice as long to do a particular job if you're also trying to create content for social media. So, yeah, it is definitely a balancing act. Well, as usual, we'll put links to those accounts in the show notes as well, make it easy for people to find. Look, Con, really appreciate your time. It's been great getting some insight into John 2 and your background, learning how to tune. Hopefully it's going to be useful for others who are maybe thinking of going down a similar path. And obviously, we don't get to learn about the inner workings of a world record holding drag car too often. So we do appreciate you sharing all of the inner workings with us. And obviously look forward to seeing if you can and sometime crack it into the 5-second zone. That would be absolutely amazing.
We'd love that, mate. Thank you for having me on, and appreciate everything.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Con from CRD, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that, in turn, helps us to continue to get more high-quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to James from Automotive in Australia, who has said, the HPA podcast is hands down my favourite podcast of all. Such amazing knowledge in every bit of their content and every aspect they delve into. Andre interviews a lot of extremely interesting people at the top of their game who I would not have otherwise found to follow. I also find, as someone who has done multiple HPA courses in tuning, wiring and engine building, that the podcast itself certainly contains a great deal of knowledge and information which is extremely well explained and broken down to become extremely understandable. Thank you again, HPA. Well, thanks for the kind words, James. Great to hear you're getting such value out of the podcast. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.